Hello, my dear friend. Today I did something a little crazy, as I am prone to do. I bought a knitting machine, and I have never knit a thing in my life. I understand that hand knitting and machine knitting are really two separate things, but I don't know how to do either of them. Regardless, I've been in the market for a knitting machine for probably about a year now. A while ago, I got super into dyeing yarn, and I was binge watching a bunch of YouTube videos, and I stumbled upon one, and I think it was by Rebecca from Kim Knits, where she talked about dyeing knitted sock blanks to make gradient yarns. I just got super obsessed with the idea of gradient yarns. I tried my hand at it, but I use cotton yarn, and I don't think they sell any knitted cotton blanks, so I just wound a bunch of mini hanks of yarn that were all connected together to dye the gradient. It just kind of was a tangled mess. It ended up working and I got a gradient, but I thought that my life would just be so much easier if I had a knitting machine. So I've been looking for knitting machines and asking my friends who own knitting machines, and they're so expensive, even used. And I could never really be sure which kind I wanted because some of them are for bulkier yarn, some of them are for finer yarns. But the other day I stumbled upon a Facebook Marketplace listing in my area for a Passap Duomatic 80 knitting machine. It's a double bed machine, so you can knit tubes, like if you wanted to make socks or something. So I did a bunch of research, and there's actually quite a lot of YouTube videos about this specific machine, and people seem to really love it. So that was really encouraging to me. So I reached out to the woman who was selling the loom. Oops, I said loom. So I reached out to the woman selling the machine to ask a couple questions, and she told me that it would be at an estate sale this weekend. So today we went to look at it, and I didn't really know what I was looking at, but I wanted to make sure that it had the punch card system and it had the thing that you use to transfer your yarn from one bed to the other, because that seems important. I have no idea if it's in good shape. I have no idea if I have all the pieces or not. I literally just brought it into my house and it's sitting in front of me, waiting for me to go mess with it. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm really excited about this, if you cannot tell. Okay, here she is. I'm sitting on the floor because one, I don't have very much room in this room on account of there is a gigantic loom right here, a desk there, and a bed in front of me. And two, because I want you to see how freaking massive this thing is. Like, yes, I own a 60-inch loom, but this thing's huge. So this is the part that you put the punch cards in, and I think it changes how the needles move up and down. This part is supposed to slide back and forth, but it doesn't move right now. I haven't explored that at all, but I will. That part says deco. I think that it's, these things are the same, or they're connected somehow. I literally have no idea what I'm doing. And this is a box of stuff that came with it. So this whole situation is supposed to be up top. It's what holds the yarn, and it is just a total mess. There's these cute little cone holders, and I'm wondering if I'll be able to fit this in my cone winder. It looks really small, but I'll have to check and see. So that would be nice. These are some punch cards. I literally have no idea how this works. I've seen punch cards, of course, for the loom, and I get the concept. Kind of, but understanding and seeing and doing are all very different things. This piece is supposed to be attached on that side. They took it off to be moved, and so I'll put that back on. This thing I know is what transfers the yarn from one of the beds to the other. So this is something that I was definitely looking for to make sure that this machine had before I bought it. You can do it by hand, but I saw them how easy you just, and it does. So I wanted this. And there's something in here that I don't know what it is. This, have no idea. And this. Oh, I think these are weights. That makes sense because they're really heavy. So that's cool. They say that on this machine you shouldn't have to weight a lot of things down, but I'm assuming that sometimes you do. So that's good to know. It's also good to know that this wasn't even really, it doesn't look used. I just broke the rubber band. And there's just some more. It says yarn spinner, patent pending 1984. Oh. Okay. I mean, this really doesn't look like it was wound by a machine, so maybe she just And there is a bag of tools. In here there's oil, there's the things that you can transfer, the loops, there's these things that have to do with whether you are using one bed or two beds. I know very little about this, but those are the things I do know. Can you trust oil that's probably 20 years old? I know this machine is supposed to use a lot of oil, so I'm gonna have to research. Oh man, it looks like some leaked in the bag. So that's cool. So overall, I'm not sure how often the person who owned this before used it. It seems like kind of a minimal amount of accessories. It's kind of like only what came with, I keep wanting to call it a loom, the machine, and she didn't buy a lot more. I know how I am. If I have something, I need all the bells and whistles, so I don't know how much she used this. So I really have no idea what condition this is in or if it even works. The fact that this is not moving is kind of a red flag for me, but not enough that I didn't buy it. So we shall see. After watching a couple of YouTube videos about this machine, I decided to take the pushers and the needles out to clean them. Before you can get to those, you've got to remove the edge springs, the row counter trigger, and both locks. I don't know what I did to finally get the locks to move, but they eventually did. Once you get all that off, you can remove the metal piece from inside the needle rail. I don't know what that's called. The actual removal of the needles and the pushers was kind of an ordeal. The needles weren't too bad, you just have to push them up and pull them forward and out of the channels. Sometimes they got a little stuck, but it wasn't a big deal. The only real issue I found with the needles is that a few of them had rust on them, and one of them in particular was totally rusted shut. The pushers, however, were a nightmare. You use the same motion to remove the pushers as you do the needles, but I guess the old oil and dust just gunked up in the channels and it made them incredibly hard to move. At first, when I was just working on the front bed, I was super stoked because everything seemed pretty clean. The rust on the needle on the back bed is concerning to me, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. Don't quote me on that. I didn't notice any bent needles or any like huge glaring globs of anything super disgusting, so that's good. It's kind of weird for me to be calling it a needle because it is very much a hook to me. There's nothing needly, unless you consider the hook part the eye of the needle, then it might be needly. Anyway, I'm very tired. It is past midnight and I didn't sleep very good last night because I was too excited thinking about going to see this machine. So I think I'm gonna call it. I haven't decided whether I want to totally dismantle this entire thing to like do a super deep clean or if I just kind of want to do surface level cleaning. I feel like it very much deserves a super deep clean, and I love doing that whenever I get a new piece of equipment or a tool. I just love to take it apart and deep clean it so it kind of like gives me an idea of what I'm working with. I have separated the needles from the front bed and the back bed so I can kind of see how many of the back bed are messed up, and it might be easier to decide if I need to replace them. I'm not sure. But these are all the pushers, and this is the back bed needles and the front bed needles. I think there are 160 needles and 160 pushers. So my fingers are quite sore. All right, I think that's it for tonight. So I'll see you tomorrow.
4 to 6 days later.
Okay, so I took it completely apart. I still don't know how this machine works, but I feel like taking it apart and putting it back together is the first step in getting an understanding of it. I also think that it bonds me to the machine in a way. I'm much more invested in maintaining it now that I kind of know where everything goes and what it's supposed to look like when it's clean. To take the machine apart, I had to get it off of the stand and onto the floor. It's just held onto the stand by 2 C-clamps, which are easy to unscrew. The machine is super heavy, and I probably shouldn't have been lifting it by myself, but oh well. Once I got it onto the floor, I removed the side plate thing and the color changer. They just unscrew by hand. Then, to access the rest of the screws, I had to flip the whole thing upside down, which feels very wrong and like I was going to break something, but you know, it turned out fine. The nuts and washers on the inside are really tiny and sometimes hard to reach, so I had to use this super extendo thing on my screwdriver. I don't know what it's called, I'm not a professional. At first I was just removing all of the nuts by hand until at some point I realized that I could be using needle nose pliers instead, which was infinitely easier. Some of the screws were long and my super extendo thing didn't work, so I used the pliers to loosen them until I could unscrew them by hand. I removed all of the screws in the holes under the machine, which let me take off both rails and the springs so that I could remove the side plates and the needle beds. Everything I did on the front bed, I did to the back bed. In between each section of the bed, there's a needle channel and a little flimsy metal spacer. I put the spacers to the side and tried to handle them as little as possible because they are just so thin and I was worried that they would break. Once everything was off the machine, I could see just how totally gross the machine was. Ugh. The next step was to remove all of the metal channels from the plastic beds. I saw in a comment on another video that this step wasn't necessary unless the channels were damaged, but I just wanted everything to be as good and as clean as it should be. This was probably my favorite part of the whole process. I don't know why, but it was just super satisfying to yoink out all those metal bits. The channels got put into 2 big old mason jars into which I poured isopropyl alcohol. Please, if you're gonna do this, be in a well-ventilated area. Those fumes are no joke. I put a lot of alcohol in there and then I gently spun the jar. You don't want these pieces to be clanking around. I did the same thing with the needles, the pushers, and even all of the screws, just for funsies. Then I wiped everything down and put them back into fresh alcohol just to make sure they were super clean. After I was done, I brought everything outside to dry. While I was waiting for all of that to dry, I scrubbed down all the plastic pieces and by golly they were dirty. I soaked them for a while in the sink and rinsed them, and then I put them outside to dry too. But then I got impatient, so I decided to blow dry them instead. When I was sure that they were totally dry, I started putting the channels back in. This was another really fun part of the process for me. After that, I basically just did the disassembly in reverse. I put the plastic pieces back on the frame, the beds click in and align with the screw holes. I cleaned off all the other plastic pieces and even used some goo remover to get off some old gunk. It made a huge difference, and you can see that the plastic became discolored with age because it's very white where the gunk used to be. I put the side pieces back on where they belong, then I sorted out all of the screws and started putting them back in their proper places. I noticed that I hadn't pushed some of the channels all the way in, so I used my orange tool to do that. Then it was time for me to reinsert the channels between the needle bed sections. I had to pay really close attention to how well each channel fit in that spot. In one place, I had a very loose channel that would fall out super easily, so I put 2 spacers in that spot and left it out of another one that didn't feel like it needed it. Next, I put in the screws for the top rail and slid it on. I taped the rails down so that they wouldn't fall off when I flipped it back over. And a word to the wise, do not use packing tape. I did that because it was the closest tape I had on hand and it was a terrible idea. It left a residue, and so now I'm gonna have to use the goo remover again. Then I just screwed in all the screws for the bottom rail and then gently put on the nuts for the top rail. You need to leave the top rail loose so that you can take it back off to put the needles back in. It definitely was not easy, but it worked. After that, I removed the top rail and put the needles back in their channels. Most of them just go right in, but for the ones on either side of the screw, you have to angle the needle underneath it to get in there. Then I did the same thing for the pushers. At the time, I was watching a video about what to do if your pushers are damaged, and I figured that since mine were so hard to move, they must be. So I was doing like the video said and trying to gently flex them, but I zoned out for like half a second and snapped one totally in half. At that point, I decided that it wasn't worth the risk and I would just see how it worked out with the hard to move pushers. I put the spring back in where it goes and slid the top rail back on. Then I put back in this long metal thing that goes in that slot on the rail. I tightened all the screws for the final time. I put the machine back on the stand and reattached the C-clamps. Then of course I put everything else back, like the locks, the color changer, and the extension plates. I even reassembled the yarn tensioners, as you can see. I am super excited to get working with this machine after I do the goo remover. If you're as curious to see this machine in action as I am, be sure to stick around. Hopefully in the future one of these videos floating around my head will be of that very thing. See you there.